The French New Wave is one of the most popular movements in film history. Whenever people talk about innovative filmmaking, the French New Wave tends to be in discussion. People really enjoy the playful and lightheartedness of these films. They tend to bend the rules that filmmaking has established. These films can be quite dark and bleak, depicting the struggles of the French people after World War II. However, despite its popularity, we don't find the movement as some people make it out to be. It's almost always put at the top of discussion for most important film movements, but to us, it doesn't compare to the most important art movement in filmmaking. We think the Russian cinematic films of the 1920s have established not only the rules for theatrical filmmakers, but for the filmmakers of tomorrow. Our view is that the French cinema in the 1960s isn't on the level of the montage filmmakers in Russia. For those of you that don't know, the French movement came to life in the late 50s and early 60s. The two most prominent filmmakers that represent it are Jean-Luc Godard and François Truffaut. They prided themselves on taking the norms of Hollywood greats like Alfred Hitchcock, Howard Hawks, and Nicholas Ray. They basically took all the standards of Hollywood and did them in their own ways, not only sticking to a Hollywood formula at first, but using this formula against itself and building something unique to French culture. They copied the techniques of Hollywood directors and made them their own. The classic quote from Picasso about great artists stealing applies best to the French New Wave. The filmmakers from this period are hailed as game changers, rule breakers. People in the film community are obsessed with their personality and how they made films. A lot of people like their films because of their vibrant and playful personality. There was an authenticity to them that made them unique to the French way of doing things. The dialogue was direct, yet ambiguous to the plot of the story. Characters would often go on rants or have thoughtful monologues that the audience could reflect on with them. After their first couple of films, they began to experiment a little more with story structure, especially during the writing of the films. Some of them took the extreme of improvising entire films, barely writing dialogue or settings, often coming up with them on site. Their films would grow to lack structure and rigidity of Hollywood films and become fluid and vibrant expressions of the filmmakers that never failed to be free-flowing. To the people who were accustomed to how Hollywood films were shot, acted, and played out, this was a breath of fresh air, and they were often adored by these audiences. Critics not only praised the stories and the narrative structure of them, but they also grew to appreciate some of the technicalities of these films. They were edited with unique flair, almost in the way that jazz is composed, as images blended together even though they had nothing to do with the scene. The camera work would often reflect this too, as a lot of the footage was handheld and amateurish, which a lot of people saw as charmful. People were so used to the rigid, symmetrical view of Hollywood films that when the French applied a documentary shooting style to offbeat narratives, it was a new experience for them. Their films tackled existential questions like death, the purpose of government, the meaning of youth and rebellion. All these French filmmakers were facing existential questions after World War II, especially with their own identity and purpose in the world. This was really reflected across Europe and in the United States, as people started reflecting on their society after the war and became very critical of it. People had good-paying jobs, were able to raise a family, and yet no one felt happy. No one felt a long-lasting connection with their partner nor coworker. This internal conflict was expressed throughout the 60s and 70s in many films that represented the same pessimistic attitude as the French New Wave. Despite the praise and favoritism that this movement had received, there is a camp within the film community that views the movement as shallow. Some people are critical of their themes and explorations of them, often debating that these films don't go in depth with their analysis of a problem. Instead, they use platitudes and subjective sequences to display an issue that some people feel needs to be developed more fully. People often conclude, after watching a few French films from this era, that these filmmakers are pretentious, that they take themselves too seriously and actually have very little to say. I can agree with this sentiment at some degree, but the movement has also been influential to the art house industry of today. Let's explore this a bit more. The beginning films of this era were often grounded and shot documentary style, as I stated earlier. This was achieved by handheld cameras being manufactured in the 50s on a wider scale, so they became more affordable for filmmakers. This, combined with the playful delivery of witty dialogue, quickly built an audience that was very interested in these films. For a few years, these techniques were explored and played with, until the filmmakers got bored with them and began to look at different avenues of expression. Some French filmmakers would stay in that convention and become successful in some sort of mainstream fashion. Others would continue to try and experiment. Stories would become more random. The camera and edit would seem to have more freedom, capturing and showing things that would have little to do with the actual story. This is where people came to dislike the filmmakers' way of telling their story. They would go on detours, showing or discussing things that mattered very little to the plot or narrative that was building. Nonetheless, it built the aesthetic of their films, and their audience became more solidified throughout the years of the 60s. The tail end of the 60s saw a lot of filmmakers explode in experimentation. This was due to the revolution in France that would last a month, named May 68. Here, filmmakers' stories would focus on the faults of capitalism, criticizing alienation and the culture around work. It reflected the counterculture of the 60s, as so many people were tired with the culture that capitalism had built up after the Second World War. Not to mention the revolutionary attitude in Europe during this period. Unions had begun to exercise their rights, striking more to try and maintain what they had won in the previous decade, as capitalism was beginning to see the end of its golden age. Political discussions of wage cuts and cuts to health care and public funding began. The workers were furious with these proposals, and in some cases there were actions to cut back on the workers' rights. People grew into a combative mindset, combined with the fact that they felt the culture capitalism provided was beginning to fail. Most of the films were more pessimistic about life, love, and the purpose of human beings. They were critical of capitalism, but weren't able to come up with a genuine solution. So a lot of their films would go on to critique wage labor, or the fall of family life, or how it was difficult to fall in love. But it couldn't give the audience a solution to these problems. The French filmmakers were short-sighted like everyone else, and they could only express the depressed mood of society. They failed to motivate the French workers to continue their fight and rebellious attitude in a meaningful manner. Their philosophy at its core is pessimistic, mostly due to them being existentialists. Philosophers who practice existentialism tend to ask very deep questions and explore all the possibilities and complexities the questions will have, yet fail to answer them. They tend to leave things to the audience to decide the meaning, not really steering them in a specific direction when it comes to their artistic message. They believe the audience should determine the meaning of an artwork, and although this is true, this is a partial truth. The filmmaker must direct the audience to an answer without blatantly giving them the answer. The audience does not need to work for the answer, but they should also be given one hidden in the film. After the stint in the 60s, the camps of French filmmaking split up into two groups, one mainstream, the other more obscure. The mainstream films really never left the techniques of the early 60s because it always worked and people grew to like them as an alternative to Hollywood. The other group continued to experiment and stretch what they could with the medium. A lot of their projects didn't come out to anything, and they often had to come back to the theatrical formula in order to gain any attention from the community. The following decades of French cinema hasn't really added to filmmaking in any significant manner. They continue to use the techniques of the past and failed to significantly build off them. Filmmaking has really plateaued since the artistic explosion in the 60s. We think there's a key reason to this, and we'll explain it later in the video. As for its influence on modern cinema, the French New Wave lives everywhere, not because it's revolutionary, nor because it has changed filmmaking, but because people like the style of these films. People like how playful they were, often how they tackle serious problems, but don't really explore them in any great depth. People like the tangents these films go on, and they see it as an efficient way to discuss social issues. We, on the other hand, don't see these films as efficient when it comes to talking about political and social issues, nor do we see it as a revolutionary film movement in comparison to what we consider revolutionary. My position on the French New Wave is that it is a unique movement in film history. However, it is not revolutionary. It did not fundamentally change nor alter filmmaking as a creative art form, because their techniques were actually executed far before they did them, along with the fact that these films stayed within the bounds of theater, using actors, sets, and characters to tell a visual story. It's not as important as people make it out to be. They merely just established a different perspective for theatrical films that were very similar to Hollywood productions. The techniques of these French guys aren't really that special, and certainly not revolutionary. People have been editing that way since the 20s, with experimental cuts jumping from subject to subject. Their editing is certainly not extreme when you compare it to what the Russian filmmakers Vertov and Eisenstein established 40 years before them. As for their shooting, this is something that has definitely influenced other art filmmakers the past 50 years or so. That's not to say it's a good thing or even a bad thing. In my opinion, their influences are irrelevant to the art filmmakers of today, because the art filmmakers of today are irrelevant. Neither have pushed the medium to new heights the way the Russian filmmakers were able to in the 1920s. That's because they studied the medium. They learned the dynamics of editing images together, along with figuring out the social conflict of theater being a part of filmmaking when it has nothing to do with the physical components of a film. Not only are French techniques nothing special, but so is their social commentary. The thing we should really consider when discussing a political issue is this. Can you display to the audience a solution to the problem? Do you know what the problem is and how we solve it? Can you show that visually? Or can you only point out the negative, but when it comes to give the audience an answer, you, all of a sudden, don't know as much? This doesn't really make them any different than one of your family members, coworkers, or random people on the street that share their life experiences about how they have struggled, their mistakes and lessons in life, yet they fail to point you in a direction where you can genuinely change the current state of the world. These types of pessimistic stories have been told for countless years throughout human history, failing to point humans in a positive and progressive direction within the current society. To us, filmmaking was changed 100 years ago when French and Russian filmmakers decided that filmmaking doesn't need actors, sets, costumes, characters, and so on. All the theatrical elements are not for the storytelling of film, they are for the storytelling of theater. In my opinion, if you are still making theatrical films, you cannot call yourself a revolutionary. You cannot say you're changing filmmaking or progressing it forward. The New Wave in France may have developed theatrical filmmaking, but it did not change filmmaking as a medium. Everything done in this movement has been done prior, whether it be in filmmaking, theater, or literature. It may be a unique movement, but it is only unique to theatrical filmmaking, and it has not revolutionized film as a whole. Not only does it come with the failure to separate from theater and literature, but also the failure to apprehend the theoretical development of the edit being more important than the image. A lot of these filmmakers make it their interest to utilize the beauty of a shot or display a whole sequence in a limited number of shots to allow the element of the image to dominate over the edit. They do this to show the beauty of the image, to allow the audience to soak up its composition. In doing this, they bring the edit to a smaller role, only allowing it to develop the plot forward. Even with the creative ways they used editing, the filmmakers were more concerned with showing the characters and locations rather than building a montage sequence for their films. It's hard to build a montage sequence with theatrical elements, as the actors and setting needs to often be displayed with wide shots instead of intense close-ups. Even though this was done by Sergei Eisenstein, it really hasn't been replicated to the same level since. To add one last contention I have with this movement, and so many others, is its philosophy on life. Existentialism in filmmaking hasn't accomplished anything significant. It merely allows the filmmakers to complain about the aspects of real life and fail to give the audience a better outlook on the world around them. It really only sees these filmmakers as just another pessimistic philosopher. They may have creative ways of complaining, but they are complaining nonetheless, and I'd rather listen to answers when discussing the problems of the world. The French New Wave is an important movement in film history. It displayed the counterculture of France in the 1960s and the development of the art house in Europe. Yet this movement, in our opinion, didn't revolutionize the medium. It merely parodied the Hollywood films of the 50s. It didn't change any film techniques, as the film techniques they used were already established in the previous decades. We should look to the filmmakers Eisenstein and Vertov as the revolutionaries to base our progressive theory on. Our view is that film should separate from theater and literature, that we should look to study filmmaking and its components. We need to do this in order to develop the medium and progress it forward towards its full potential. Its full potential being a medium that can convince millions of a vision that can motivate and push people to actively improving the world around them. If there's anything you don't understand or something I didn't communicate well, please comment about it below and I'll make sure to address it in future videos. If you've agreed with what you've heard in this video, join our community and journey towards building a revolutionary film theory.